Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
Well, Tuesday morning after we finished up the Newsmaker, Dr. Gary Ostrower off the air, as he was walking out of the studio, said, I'd really like to do a show about the Civil War and talk about General Grant. And so we have him on today to talk about the Civil War and General Grant. Dr. Gary Ostrower, Alfred University history professor, thank you for coming on today.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here, Brian.
Well, Dr. Ostrower, take it away. What got you wanting to talk about the Civil War?
I had been reading about the Civil War. I guess that's what we historians do lots of times. And in particular, I was reading a book by Ron Chernow. Some of you may know the name of Ron Chernow. He wrote a biography of Alexander Hamilton, and that biography of Hamilton became the basis for the play in initially New York, and then eventually all over the place. It's played in Rochester, it's played in Buffalo, in London, and so forth. But Chernow also wrote a very, very good biography of Grant. And, General Grant, who was, of course, the key American Union general during the Civil War, and then eventually became president of the U.S. For 2 terms from 1869 until 1877. So I thought, we think that we know a lot about Grant, but I'd like to, make some additional comments about him because I certainly learned things from the Chernow biography that I did not know before. And I guess we should begin at the beginning. I mean, Grant was born early in the 19th century, in 1822 to be exact. He was born in Ohio, but then he eventually moved to Illinois. He lived in St. Louis, fought as an American general during the Mexican War. The Mexican War, was fought from 1846 to about 1848, and before that, he had spent 4 years at West Point. So, in some ways, he had fairly traditional military training for that period. And I might also mention that as a result of his West Point experience and also his experience during the Mexican War, he knew a lot of other officers, both Union but also eventually Confederate officers that were, to one extent or another, involved, of course, in the period between 1861 and 1865 when the Civil War was fought. And when I say that he knew them, he kind of knew their personalities. He knew some of their strengths. He knew some of their weaknesses. And I think that that was one of the things which ultimately would make him perhaps somewhat more effective than otherwise might have been the case during the 4 years of the Civil War itself. He was, I think, a great general. As a matter of fact, I would probably say that looking over the span of American history, Washington and Grant were probably the 2 greatest generals that we had ever produced. And I might add one more thing while I'm saying this. General Washington was elevated by Congress during the Revolutionary War to the rank of lieutenant general. That was the highest rank of any American officer during the Revolutionary War. During the Civil War, Grant began as a colonel, then as a brigadier general, and eventually he became a lieutenant general. And he was appointed by President Lincoln to that post in 1864. He was the only American general during the Civil War to have that rank. And he was the only American general to hold that rank other than General Washington. So I think that gives you some idea as to the esteem in which he was held by not only Union politicians generally, but specifically, of course, by Lincoln.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower this morning about General Grant and the Civil War. I pulled up the History Channel's website, which is what I have to do. Dr. Ostrower does not have to do that. There was an article called 10 Things You Might Not Know About Ulysses S. Grant. The first, I did know, the S for his middle initial does not stand for anything. I think I'd heard that before. This is an interesting one, number 7. Ulysses Grant prevented Robert E. Lee from being charged with treason after the Civil War. It says when Grant's accepted the surrender of Robert E. Lee's army. He offered generous terms that paroled Confederate soldiers and officers and allowed them to return to their homes. And it goes on to say that he General Grant prevented Robert E. Lee from being charged with treason. Dr. Ostrower, your thoughts there?
Well, he was a generous man. He was a real gentleman in a way that, lots of other military figures have not quite measured up. General Grant, and this goes right back to, some of the early battles in late 1861 into early 1862, almost always treated his opponents with respect. Now, they didn't always deserve respect, but for the most part, he understood that if you treat them with respect, they may treat some of you, some of your own men, as well as you, with a kind of mutual respect as well. And I think that he, understood fully that by the end of the war, the South was going to become, once again, part of the Union. There's going to have to be a kind of reconciliation. He was a very, very strong supporter of Reconstruction, a very strong supporter of the idea that the South was going to have to, accept the fact that slavery no longer existed after 1865. But by the same token, he felt that there was a means of how shall I put it, of reconciliation, that we're all part of one country rather than two countries. He had made that point during the war itself, and I think that helps somewhat to explain why he did not charge Lee with treason. But there's something else involved, and that is that he knew Lee. He had a great deal of respect for Lee, just as I think General Lee had a great deal of respect for Grant. And that may, carry us back in some ways to, the earlier part of the war. Grant, during the early section of the war, and I'm talking about the period from about 1861 until late 1863, Grant was largely unknown by the American public. And the reason was that he was fighting in the West, not in the East. So in many of the major battles that hit the newspapers in Washington, D.C., and New York, and Buffalo, and so forth, battles such as the Battle of Manassas or Bull Run, the Battle of Chancellorsville, Antietam, and then eventually, of course, Gettysburg. That was very, very well known to the American public during that period. Somewhat less well known were those Western battles, including battles at Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Shiloh, and eventually Vicksburg. Those are the battles that Grant was involved in. And while he was very, very successful, and his success was certainly evident to military officials in Washington, to the Secretary of War, whose name was Stanton, and of course to Lincoln himself, nevertheless, he really wasn't known to the American public until somewhat later. I would mention along those lines that Grant was also somewhat hobbled by a reputation for being an alcoholic. It was often claimed, especially by his critics, some of them were Southern, Confederate critics, that he was often drunk. And to a certain extent, there's some truth to that. But I want to make something that is, I think, has been missed by many, many historians, and this is a point that Ron Chernow, I think, really elucidates. Grant was rarely, ever, in any way hobbled during military operations. When he had been, I think, an alcoholic, unquestionably, indulging in excess during the 1850s. But by the 1860s, he was essentially weaning himself away from alcohol. Not entirely. Every so often he would indulge, but he would tend to indulge, if he did it all, after battles, not during battles. There is not one single battle during the Civil War that I can pinpoint, in fact, that any historian can pinpoint, when Grant was actually drunk during the battle itself. And I think that it's important to say that. So, there was an alcohol problem, but it was not a problem that that affected his military effectiveness. And I would say one other thing about his alcoholism. And that is that, for the most part, he had withdrawn. Often what he would do during dinners, during especially some of the ceremonial dinners when other people were there, is he would simply turn his wine glass over turn it upside down. And it was simply a way of saying, of kind of advertising the fact that he was no longer drinking alcohol. For the most part, he did not during the period between 1861 and 1865, and I think we have to give him a lot of credit for the discipline with which he dealt with that whole problem.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower about General Grant and the Civil War. I want to get slightly off topic just for a moment, Dr. Ostrower. Libertarians will get into trouble sometimes for saying that they're for states' rights, which in the Civil War period, states' rights meant pro-slavery. Question, if the southern states had been successful in leaving, if Lincoln had permitted that, what do you see as having happened then?
That's a good question, and of course, it's one of those iffy questions. It's difficult to give you an answer that everyone would agree with. I know I do want to bring this back to Grant, and I'm glad you asked that question. Grant was himself very, very much a Unionist, when many others, including occasionally Northern people, generals, people who had been trained at West Point, a few of them, like a fellow named John Pemberton, who was born in Pennsylvania, raised in Pennsylvania, but he wound up fighting for the Confederacy. As a matter of fact, at the famous Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862, one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war, it was Pemberton who was fighting in opposition to Grant, who, of course, was the main Northern general, the main Union general at the Battle of Shiloh. But Grant's support for unionism often also translated into an opposition to slavery. He was very, very much an opponent, a rather vocal opponent of slavery, and he was, of course, in the period after the Civil War, he became a strong supporter of civil rights for those ex-slaves who, mainly lived in the South, but not entirely. But I would also note the following, that he was not only a supporter of, the anti-slave cause, but he became very much a proponent for the use of black troops during the Civil War. When there were many, many Northern generals, in fact, not just Northern generals, but Northerners generally, who did not believe that blacks could fight effectively, Grant argued exactly the opposite, and eventually, between 1863, when the first black soldiers entered the Union Army, and 1865, when the war ended, Grant was able to prove, with plenty of evidence, of course, that black soldiers were every bit as effective as white soldiers during that war. Now, let me go back to your question, which is, what would have happened if the South had successfully won the Civil War, or the North had simply not fought the Civil War, in other words, simply allowed the South to secede? Well, slavery would have existed for a long time. How long? I don't know. You don't know. We do know that there were only two other countries in the Western Hemisphere, namely Cuba and also Brazil, which after 1865 held slaves. My hunch is that slavery would have somehow, managed to continue probably until maybe the Second World War, where Hitler helped to kind of discredit racism, at least overt racism. But, Brian, we just don't know the answer to that question, other than to say that, the South would have remained a slave society, and as a slave society, I think in moral terms, it would have become increasingly isolated from the rest of the Western world. The French, the British, others, of course, had all freed their own slaves, and the South would have been left, quite alone along those lines.
I want to take a quick break, and when we get back, I want to talk about the relationship between General Grant and President Lincoln. Stay with us for a very interesting show with Dr. Gary Ostrower.
Davidson's Furniture.
Don't miss Davidson Furniture's tent sale this Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, with discounts up to 75% off. Scratch and dent, closeouts, all bargain hunters will not be disappointed. Come early for the best selection. Lounge chairs, Serta mattresses, dining tables, and $1 and $5 bins with pillows and accessories. Cash or check only with all sales final. Davidson's Furniture tent sale only this weekend. Don't miss out.
Davidson's.
Checking in now with meteorologist Rob Carolyn. Hey, Rob, what's new?
I was wandering into a store the other day and bumped into a guy wearing a shirt from Alfred University. So I said to him, "You ever been to Hornell?" And he kind of looked stunned. And he goes, "How do you know about Hornell?" And I said, "Well, I work with a radio station there." He's like, "Oh, okay." He seemed surprised anybody knew where it was located.
And for our listeners, meteorologist Rob Carolyn is in New England.
I am, though I spent time in Western New York. I went to the University of Buffalo for a year, and I used to drive through your part of the world quite frequently when I was a lot younger. And what's driving through the area this morning, Brian, is some cloudiness, though not everybody's seeing it. It's stretched out from the shoreline of Lake Erie, from just around Orchard Park and Dunkirk, off to the east through the Finger Lakes and Dansville, and then almost as far east as Albany. But it's a rather thin band, only about 80, 90 miles wide. There are some breaks, and I think what it's going to do is end up producing partial sunshine here today. Also looks like we may see a shower or a thunderstorm. We're going to become more unstable over the course of the next couple of days. It's going to be getting colder above us, and that may allow for some showers and storms. In fact, already this morning we can see them out over Michigan. If we get one, it's later this afternoon. Temperatures today, they're going to be 75 to 80. Looks like sunrise this morning was at 6:18. It'll set tonight at 8:11. Tonight, any showers or storms that do develop will taper off during the evening. We'll have some cloudiness overnight. We're 60 to 65. Tomorrow, we turn partly sunny, but we remain chilly aloft, so that could trigger another shower or storm tomorrow afternoon, 80 to 85. Storms diminish tomorrow night, low 60 to 65. Saturday, partly sunny, maybe a shower or storm in the afternoon, 80 to 85. And Brian, more of the same coming up on Sunday.
And back with Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. Kind of interesting. I don't know if you caught that, Gary. You never know where you're going to run into somebody who's wearing an Alfred University shirt.
Well, apparently someone's doing it in New England, right? You know, maybe in Maine or New Hampshire. Those states sent lots of different troops, to the Civil War, as you well know.
Dr. Ostrower, what was the relationship like between, we know sometimes presidents and their generals don't always get along. Did Grant and Lincoln get along?
They got along famously for a number of different reasons. First of all, because even when Grant finally did become well-known into 1864, he made it absolutely clear that he had no political ambitions, that he would not challenge Lincoln for the presidency. And when Lincoln ran for re-election in 1864, I think Lincoln very much respected that non-political element of Grant. Secondly, because Grant was an incredibly successful general. The Union had gone through many chief generals, many generals of what we call the Army of the Potomac. They have forgettable names like McClellan and Pope and Burnside and Halleck and Meade. Okay, these guys were, to one extent or another, not as successful, not as capable as one would have hoped. At the same time, in the West, Grant was winning battle after battle. He won the battle at Shiloh, at Fort Donelson, the very, very important battle at Vicksburg. And if I can just halt here for a moment and say something about Vicksburg, and I think this will help to explain why Lincoln had such respect for Grant. The Battle of Vicksburg was in Mississippi. It was right on the Mississippi River, and whoever controlled the fort at Vicksburg could control the Mississippi. And for obvious reasons, the Union wanted to take control of that fort. It was, of course, in Confederate hands. And in 1863, Grant led an assault on Vicksburg. It lasted altogether for approximately 3 months or so. It led to a siege of Vicksburg, and it was one of those battles in which Grant took the initiative. Unlike many of the other generals in the Union Army who waited and waited and waited, unnecessarily waited for reinforcements and so forth, Grant was willing to attack. Okay, he was willing to attack in a way that served his own purposes, that certainly served the purposes of the Union time and again. Lincoln noticed that. At one point, as a matter of fact, when Grant was being criticized for being an alcoholic, Lincoln said, or reportedly said, "Look, find out what kind of liquor he likes and give it to my other generals." In other words, he wanted them to be as aggressive as Grant himself. I might add, by the way, that Lincoln did not actually say that. When the quotation was, how shall I say, repeated back to Lincoln himself, he basically said that, well, I don't know who said it, but I wish I had said it. He said something to that effect. But in any case, yeah, he had a great deal of respect for Grant, and that's why he eventually brought Grant back east, made him the Chief General of the Army of the Potomac, and it was Grant who put the pressure on Lee during 1864, during some very, very difficult and bloody campaigns at the Wilderness. Some of you may have heard of Spotsburg, the very, very important siege that lasted for about 9 months of Petersburg, which was the key to the capture of Richmond itself. So, Grant was a successful general. On the other hand, it was a very, very bloody war, and there were a couple of battles, one of them being Cold Harbor, that Grant was involved in, again in 1864, that were, exceedingly bloody, so bloody that Grant himself wound up with the reputation as being a butcher. In fact, he was often called Butcher Grant. And yet that did not faze Lincoln. Lincoln understood exactly that Grant, more than any of his other generals, was willing to carry the fight to the Confederates to force the end of the war by 1865.
Reading off the History Channel's website, Dr. Ostrower, that Grant was very tough in his efforts against the KKK. Looks like he comes out looking like a pretty good guy, Dr. Ostrower.
Oh, I think historians have a much more favorable view of Grant today than they did, let's say, 40 or 50 years ago. Southern historians tended to diminish the importance of Grant, or else to sully the reputation of Grant, by focusing on his alcoholism. And also during the period when Grant was president, there were a number of scandals. There were serious scandals. And of course, his critics would argue that he was responsible for these scandals. The fact of the matter is that, yeah, there were scandals, but Grant himself was an exceedingly honest person. He had as much integrity, and boy, compare this to the guy in the White House right now. He had as much integrity as any president who has ever served in that office. And I think that, historians are much more aware of that today, taking account of some of the things that you just mentioned. His reputation has really soared. Now, I'm not saying that, we call him one of the greatest presidents. He himself would not have considered himself one of the greatest presidents. But he's certainly considered a very, very good and in some ways a very effective president, especially in the area of race relations and Reconstruction.
Yes, it sounds like it was a very important part of the Reconstruction period was going after the KKK. Dr. Gary Ostrower, thank you so much for joining us today. We've got to leave it there, but I'm glad you asked to come on to talk about this topic. Very interesting.
Well, there's more to say about the Civil War, so maybe we'll get to do that one of these days.
That would be great. Thank you so much, Gary.
You're welcome. Bye-bye now.